Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
But God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, his church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Welcome to another edition of the Q Podcast. I'm Gabe Lyons. It's so exciting when we come off of a week like this past week where we have over 1,000 people decide to host dinners in their home and invite people in to have substantive conversation around topics normally off limits now to discuss in our society. And now around dinner tables, people are talking this last week about race, about racism in our country, about the ways we each can hold on to some implicit racial bias, the term that David Bailey uses, who gives this 9-minute talk. And so this week, what we wanted to do on our podcast is actually let all of you, many of you I know that weren't able to host a dinner or attend a dinner, actually hear the talk that drove the conversations this last week around dinner tables. And I think when you listen to it, not only are you going to find it refreshing and warm and inviting, but you're also going to consider, maybe I should host dinner around this topic. And it's not too late to do that. You can go to qdinners.com, even though last week was the week where we invited the majority of people to participate. If you're listening now, do it now. It's actually rather simple. And this actual talk begins to kick off a dinner conversation around a few questions that we provide for you that I think your friends would find so refreshing, because there's just not a lot of places where we can talk about this kind of stuff anymore. And so David Bailey, I just want you to know a little bit about him. He's an amazing man. He's part of our board for our organization, but he founded something called Arrabon. And Arrabon is this ministry that equips churches and nonprofits with the tools and resources to really shepherd their community in understanding diversity along racial, ethnic, and class divisions toward living out a practice that really embodies what they learned. And I've seen him walk me through that. He's walked several friends of mine through this, several churches, and he's the kind of just gentle soul that can come in, understands the history of this really tense topic for some churches or some places, and he can walk people through understanding God's call to all of us to come together and to work together. He's done incredible work and lives in Richmond, where he has led something called the Urban Doxology Project. He loves music. His wife's an amazing artist. So I'm going to stop now. I just want you to listen to David deliver this wonderful 9-minute talk on implicit racial bias.
So I believe that the church should live and lead by example in the areas of diversity and reconciliation. Now, God has made the church a reconciling community. That's what he created the church to be. But why is it that the church is better known as a segregated community than a reconciling community? It is our reconciliation for one another that gives credibility to the reconciliation between God and humanity through Jesus Christ. Now, there aren't a lot of people in this room that would disagree with that statement. But again, we're known more as a segregated community than a reconciling community. So I was kind of given the task or the question to answer the question, are we or do we have a problem with racism in America? So I thought I'd just pray about it, ask God. Yes. Okay. The problem isn't the civil rights understanding of racism, but the post-civil rights methodology of colorblindness. So this idea of colorblindness is that, I don't see color. I just see grayish humanoids. It's one of those things that has good intentions, but it's very misguided. It comes from Dr. King's idea that one day that his children, he had a dream that children not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. But considering the fact that we've had over 400 years of racism and systemic injustice, we got to realize that colorblindness is not the way to handle our history. Colorblindness is a problem for two main reasons. One reason is the fact that colorblindness does not acknowledge the image of God and diverse people groups. The second thing is that colorblindness actually encourages us to do surface level diversity and be passive in reconciliation. But again, God's called the church to be a what? Now, I learned how to preach in the black church, and so, you got to talk back, right? All right. Thank you, brother. Got one. All right, so what do we do? How do we become a reconciling community? It takes intentionality, vulnerability, and confession. So here is my community in Richmond, Virginia. You'll have all kinds of people. You have people of different races, ethnicities. You have people who are millionaires in this picture, and you have people who are homeless people in this picture. You have some Reformed people, some Baptists, some Lutheran, some charismatics, and people who are suspicious of charismatics. And I'm gonna tell you something. It takes intentionality to get this kind of diversity. This type of thing just doesn't happen on its own because we're all in our world doing what we do and it makes sense to us. Now, here's one of the things that we thought. About 7 years ago when we started this community, we thought that if we just got a diverse group of people together and just hope for the best, that we could be a truly multicultural community. But even with our good intentions aren't good enough. The thing that is challenging that we met was that we all have some level of implicit racial bias. Very few of us are Jim Crow racists, but we all have this idea that in our cultural understanding, there are some things that we think are just normal. But then you add the fact that we've had over 400 years of systemic racism, and then for 30 years, we practiced this like colorblindness and thought that it would just be okay. So then all racial biases would be gone. But racial biases are the type of things that when you have an association with something that might be associated with a person, a place, a thing, or an idea that might be associated with something racial, there are these just automatic, unconscious things that come up that make you react a certain kind of way. So let me give you an example. Gabe Lyons is over 6 foot tall. I'm pretty sure that Gabe Lyons has never been referred to as a scary white man, a big scary white man. But the term big scary black man is something that sounds normal to our ears. So then both Gabe and I are two mild-mannered type of guys. But if we were supposedly express some type of anger, then the perception of an angry black man is different than the perception of an angry white man. So implicit racial biases, they influence our friendships, our networks. How do we fund things? Who do we think is qualified for leadership? And also, it affects all types of important decision-making processes. So how do we overcome implicit racial bias? We have to have safe spaces to be vulnerable and discern our implicit racial biases. About 3 to 4 years into the birth of our community, we were on a staff retreat. And one of the African-American women who was on the staff, she said, "Hey, I am hungry for somebody to know me as a woman of color. I'm angry that we talk about racial reconciliation, yet we're not doing anything about it. And I'm just tired of having a code switch just to make white people feel comfortable." So her vulnerability actually encouraged me to say, you know what? I'm a little hurt too by the cultural insensitivities from our community. And the co-pastor, another African-American man, he said, I'm really tired that I have to assimilate it to white cultural norms and I just can't be respected as a pastor. So here we were at a crossroads. We had to make a decision. Were we going to create a safe space of belonging for people to bear one another's burdens across racial and ethnic identity? Or were we going to make the dominant culture feel comfortable? And so we grew a lot as a community. And we, did some education about the issues of race, but we really learned how to be a vulnerable community and a confessing community. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit of how things happened when Ferguson and Eric Garner choking incident came up. That was a very hard time for our community. It was a hard time for me personally. It was a hard time for those who were in this particular space, really caring and living and working out reconciliation. We decided to have a prayer service. And in our prayer service, we had a time of open prayer and lamenting about what was going on. And something that we learned as a community is that a Christian community cannot be a reconciling community if it's not a confessing community. And so in this prayer, there was this 70-year-old white man that's a retired engineer. He got up and he said, God, before I came to be a part of this community, I didn't know anything about race, relations, and white privilege. I was ignorant. God, please forgive my ignorance and please forgive the ignorance of my white brothers and sisters because we just don't know. Then there was a white seminarian woman who was married to a Mexican man, and she said, you know what, as a white woman, I would never know what it's like to be a African American or a person of color here in America, but what I can say is that I know what it's like to be married to an undocumented Mexican man. And every single time I hear somebody that says, I wish those dirty Mexicans would go back home, it's like a knife being thrust into my stomach and twisted. And she's praying this and crying and wailing. And there was this youth pastor's wife, an African-American woman, that said, you know, I'm a new mother to a beautiful baby boy, African-American baby boy, and my greatest fear is that I would lose my son to implicit racial bias. That day, we did not solve the problem of race, but we learned what it meant to be a reconciling community. We got a chance to practice what it meant to be a reconciling community. So, Q, I just want to leave you one question. When you go back home, will you lead your community to be a reconciling community or a passive community? Because a reconciling community is what the hope of the world is for today. Thank you very much.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this talk, and I'm sure you can imagine now the chatter that would erupt over dinner around these topics, these conversations, even people acknowledging where in their own life they've had some of those similar experiences, where they've actually had some racial bias towards somebody, and until now, maybe they didn't realize that's what it was. But I think just by talking about it, by getting this out in the open, that's part of how we heal. It's part of how we bring truth into the light, and it allows us to deal with it versus just keeping it kind of hidden or stuffed away. And so I hope you'll continue to engage these conversations. I know on qideas.org, you can see many more talks we've done around this topic of race. Most recently, we had a wonderful talk by Duke Kwan this last year on the topic of reparations. And it was the idea of how do we repair the sins of the past where structures have been impacted by racism. And so I hope you'll consider doing that, but also think about joining us this year at our Q conference. It's not too late. We have a few seats remaining, and we're going to be sold out, 2,000 people, filling Music City Center, downtown Nashville, round tables, sitting with 8 people around your table, hearing talks just like you just heard, being challenged to talk about those with your group, and then having incredible experiences where you go out into the city of Nashville and you enjoy wonderful music, you enjoy great meals, you enjoy film and entertainment and Broadway shows, and you get to actually experience culture with your friends while you're also learning about how to think well about the year ahead and the difficult topics and conversations that are going to continue to emerge for you, your friends, your colleagues, those that you go to church with, those that you're called to lead. And so learn more and join us, qideas.org/2019. You can go there, you can see all the topics, you can see all the information about it. But because you listen to this podcast, we know you care about these kinds of conversations. It's not always easy to come to the event, but we want you to consider making the effort. The prices are at a rate that we think is completely reasonable for 3 days of engaging and finding other leaders who think about these kinds of issues, but maybe don't always have a place to explore how they're going to think and talk and interact and train and engage and equip the people around them to really understand how to sensitively, but with a posture of courage, engage culture. And so we hope you'll join us, qideas.org/2019.